Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome back to SAT Bootcamp. Thanks for joining me on your winter recess. So if you got a chance to join us yesterday, you heard the beginning of the Standard English Conventions lesson. We talked about independent clauses. We talked about dependent clauses. There will be an opportunity throughout our lesson today to kind of review what goes on with those. So that way, if you missed us yesterday, you're not feeling too far behind because that stuff is important. It kind of comes up in a lot of situations. So, welcome back to grammar. We're going to finish this lesson today. And before we get too far ahead, for attendance, you're just going to drop your name in the chat. So when you can, put your first and last name in the chat here. You're going to DM it to me or just put it in the general chat, but that's how we'll be taking attendance. All right. So, and you can keep your camera off, you can keep your camera on, whatever you're more comfortable with. I'll be asking for participation throughout the lesson. You can either just drop it in the chat, you can unmute, say something out loud, and if you don't really want to, like, let everyone know what you're thinking or show your work to everybody, you can also just private message me if you'd like to participate that way also. Okay, let's get into it. So, just to kind of go back over this table of contents, yesterday we covered independent clauses, dependent clauses. And today we're going to get to everything else. So that's commas, colons, apostrophes, and pronouns, verbs, and complex lists. So again, if you missed us yesterday, we'll have an opportunity to review independent clauses and dependent clauses. So don't worry too much. All right, this is all we got through. And this is where we left off. So, commas. We talked a little bit about purposes that they serve. For example, we talked a little bit about this comma and fanboys idea, right? So when you have two independent clauses side by side and you want to connect them in a grammatically correct way, you can connect them using a comma and a conjunction. What's a conjunction? A conjunction is one of these words: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and also, so. An S is supposed to be at the end of that. So that's one way that you can use a comma. And we also know that they can be used to separate a non-essential clause. So that's a clause that is surrounded by a pair of commas. Commas show up in other situations as well. And those situations are, they can separate independent and dependent clauses. They don't need any help in that situation. You have an independent clause, you have a dependent clause next to it. All you need is a comma, no need for a conjunction. They can separate independent and dependent clauses. Commas separate items in a non-complex list of three or more. So, looking at this example, if we have the list, I'd like to own a mansion,
I'm gonna go.
sports car, comma, Picasso painting, comma,
Yes,
and
you guys.
watch. Notice
Maybe, yeah.
item on this list, we're using a comma. And if you've heard of a thing called an Oxford comma, the SAT operates with that. So the comma after the second to last item in the list is necessary. And this is a situation where that comma and isn't about independent clauses. It's just, in a list, you use a comma in between every item, and then you also use an and to introduce the final item on the list. So, comma in between every item of a list, including the second to last and the last. You use commas after introductory clauses, phrases, or words. That's kind of another, more specific kind of dependent clause situations. The same deal there. If you have the sentence in the beginning, there was light, notice we don't need a conjunction. All we need is a comma. In the beginning, comma, there was light. Another situation you can use commas for is to separate multiple adjectives that describe the same noun. So notice this example: the big, comma, hairy monster glared down at me. You separate big from hairy with a comma. You do not, however, separate hairy from monster with a comma. Just the two adjectives. Okay? So these are the other situations you'll see commas show up. And it's important to kind of keep these things in mind because if you don't need a comma, using it is grammatically incorrect. So a good trick to remember with commas is if in doubt, leave them out. So just make sure if you're in a situation where you're choosing between either no comma and a comma, it should be one of these situations. Should be a comma fanboy. It should be in between an independent and a dependent clause. Should be in a list. Should be after an introductory clause or in between multiple adjectives that are being used to describe the same thing. But if it's not one of these situations, it's not necessary, and it would be grammatically incorrect to use one. Okay, so I mentioned that independent clauses and dependent clauses can be connected with commas. That's true. Let's say we have independent clause, then dependent clause. Let's say we have dependent clause and then independent clause. Both of these are perfectly appropriate. Grammatically, nothing is wrong with these. In fact, you can start to introduce an infinite number of dependent clauses and just kind of chuck them all together, a never-ending sentence. If you only have commas in between all of those dependent clauses, you're good to go as long as there's at least one independent clause in the sentence. That's just more of the same. You can use any number of dependent clauses. However, let's say we have this situation. Let's say we have a sentence that starts with an independent clause. After that independent clause is a dependent clause. And then after that dependent clause is an independent clause. This is incorrect if all you're using is commas to separate the clauses in this sentence, because even though there is a dependent clause in the middle, there is more than one independent clause in this sentence. So you need something extra to kind of help out the comma here to make this sentence work. So that could be a comma, but that could be replacing the comma with a semicolon. Let's say this comma becomes one or the other, then everything is fine. But even if you are separating two independent clauses with a dependent clause, that doesn't work grammatically if all you're using is commas throughout the sentence. So those are the things you need to keep in mind with commas. Let's kind of practice this. So this is a way that this might get applied on the SAT. I'm going to walk through this question on my own, and then I have a few more that we can walk through together. So this passage here, the fine powdery substance that covers the moon's surface is called regolith. Because regolith is both readily available and high in oxygen, blank, scientists have wondered whether it could be used as a potential source of oxygen for future lunar settlements. Okay, so looking at my answer choices,
powdery substance that covers the moon's surface is called regolith.
Word with different
because regolith is both readily available
what I
and
can tell
high in
that's asking
oxygen,
me is to figure
blank,
out where my independent
scientists
clauses
have
are,
wondered
and
what
from there, what I need to do about it. So, once you kind of start to practice more of these SAT questions, you can begin to identify the opportunities, just kind of ignore parts of the passage. So, quick tip, you don't need this first sentence at all. We only need to concern ourselves with what's actually around the blank. So because regolith is both readily available and high in oxygen, and then content, we would fill in the blank there to make sure we know what we're doing. So everything before the blank, because regolith is both readily available and high in oxygen, you might notice you have this because there. We learned about this concept of subordinate clauses yesterday. If you've got the word because in front of a clause, it does not matter what's in the clause. It's a dependent clause. So that's a dependent clause. What about after it? Scientists. There we go. Scientists is our subject, and have wondered is our predicate. So we have our subject. We have our predicate. Do we know what they wonder? We do know what they wonder, whether it could be used as a potential source of oxygen. So I'm seeing B's in the chat, and that is absolutely correct. In this case, all you need is a comma because this first phrase is a dependent clause. This last phrase is an independent clause. And then connecting those, all you need is a comma. It's amazing. All right, let's try the second one. So I'll read it. We can work it out together. While one requires oxygen and one does blank, and anaerobic respiration are both forms of cellular respiration. That is, they are processes by which cells break down glucose to use as energy. So in this case, similar thought process. We're trying to figure out where are our independent clauses, where are our dependent clauses, what do we need to do about that? Okay. So we can start with everything before the blank, including what we would fill in the blank. Actually, I'll split this blank in half. So we have this first phrase, while one requires oxygen and one does, and we would fill in not. Does that sound like an independent clause to us? You can say a yes, you can say a no in the chat. You can private message me if you're more comfortable that way.
No.
Nice. Nice. Seeing some no's in chat, heard a no there too. All right, that's good. That's a dependent clause. So if we fill in aerobic into the rest of that blank, aerobic and anaerobic respiration are both forms of cellular respiration, and then we have the rest of that clause. That sound like an independent clause to us? That's everything after the blank, including the word aerobic. Everything after the blank sound like an independent clause to us. We'd have to fill in aerobic into the blank as well. So in this situation, we're looking for, do we have our subject? Do we have our predicate? So filling in aerobic into the blank, and then also including anaerobic respiration. That all together would be our subject. They're the things that are like doing the action in this case. And then once we figured out we have a subject, we have to figure out, do we have a predicate? In this case, are. That's a predicate. That's a verb. Do we know what it are? It are both forms of cellular respiration. So it's a complete idea. We're connecting a dependent clause, that very, very first clause, and then there is an independent clause in the in everything after the blank. Remember, you can have multiple dependent clauses in a sentence, so all of that after the M dash checks out. But we've already identified there is an independent clause after the blank, so only one of these answer choices gives us what we need to connect a dependent clause and an independent clause. Which one looks right to us? Nice, awesome. Seeing some C's in chat. Great job. Yep, same deal. All you need is a comma to connect dependent clauses and independent clauses. Even though there are additional dependent clauses in the sentence, everything after the M dash, it still checks out because you can have an infinite number of dependent clauses in a sentence. All right, last one for this little round, this little section. So I'll give it a read, and then you can on your own try to work through this one, and then we will break it down from there. So Jamaican British artist Willard Wiggin is known for his remarkable blank. So small that they are best viewed through a microscope. Wiggins' sculptures are made from tiny natural materials such as spider web strands. So for this one, try to private message me your answers, just so that folks that are working through it don't get spoiled. But try this one on your own real quick. Take another second, see if you can lock in your answer, and then we'll go over it. All right, so let's break this one down. Same general idea as the previous ones, right? We see 4 versions of the same phrase with different combinations of either punctuation and conjunctions. We're trying to figure out where are our independent clauses and go from there. So this very first clause here, everything before the blank, Jamaican British artist Willard Wiggin is known for his remarkable, and then we would fill in microsculptures. So we can kind of split this blank in half and then think about everything here. In this case, we've got a subject, Willard Wiggin. The whole phrase Jamaican British artist Willard Wiggin is technically our subject, but we've got a subject, so that's good. And then we also have a predicate right there, is, and then we know what he is. He is known for his remarkable microsculptures. So everything over here checks out. That's an independent clause. So we got to go, past the blank, figure that out. So filling in creations so small that they are best viewed through a microscope. I'm going to pause on this comma here just to see, is this a dependent clause, and what do we need to do about that? So creation so small that they are best viewed through a microscope. We've got a noun, creations, the thing that fills in the blank. Creations. So we've got a noun that could be a subject. so small that they are best viewed through a microscope. In this case, nothing here is actually doing the grammatical work of a predicate. Creation so small. We have a viewed, we have an are, but the that makes that kind of like not serve as a predicate. That they are best viewed through a microscope kind of like turns that into not necessarily a subordinate clause, but not a predicate. It's not working the same way. So actually, everything between the blank and the comma here is a dependent clause. So do we have an independent clause after that comma? Wiggins sculptures are made from tiny natural materials, such as spiderweb strands. In this case, our subject is Wiggins sculptures, and then our predicate is are, and we know what they are. They are made from tiny natural materials. So complete idea. So everything after the comma is an independent clause. So in this case, independent clause at the very, very beginning, in between the blank and the comma is a dependent clause. After that final comma is an independent clause. So to connect, it's kind of like that very first, or sorry, it's kind of like this idea, right? Independent clause, dependent clause, independent clause. We need to figure out how to make that work grammatically. And the correct choice in this situation is actually C. If you went for B, you were in good company. This was sort of like a little bit of a diversion, I guess, from the pattern. So in this case, we need C because we're connecting independent clause to dependent clause to independent clause. So you need that period after microsculptures to make sure everything clicks together grammatically. Okay. Cool. So that's commas. Keep those things in mind. And we're going to move on to colons. So if we're just kind of thinking about like, all the punctuation, what's up with them. Colons, function-wise, I think we kind of generally understand how colons work or what they're for, I mean. So colons are for lists, for example, but they're also for explanations, examples, elaboration. They're kind of the grammatical equivalent of an equal sign, right? And when you see a colon, you can expect there to be just like something extra after that. So the kind of one of the rules, so there's a couple of grammatical rules connected to colons. One of them is that there are no rules for what happens after a colon, meaning after a colon, you can have one word, you can have a list of things, you can have a whole independent clause, you can have a dependent clause. There are absolutely no rules for what happens after a colon. However, there is one very important rule for what comes before colons, and that is that independent clauses must immediately precede a colon. You'll have an independent clause, colon, and then after that, anything goes. So that is the kind of like most essential grammatical kind of rule, principle, whatever. About colons, it must be immediately followed by a independent clause. This thing over here, the SAT doesn't really do this anymore, at least not that I really have seen, but just keep in mind, keep locked away somewhere in the back of your mind that a single dash, which is not an M dash, but a shorter dash, is the same exact thing as a colon, functionally speaking. And same rule, it has to be an independent clause and then in this case, a single dash. Okay, but yeah, lock that in, independent clause, colon, and then anything goes after the colon. So let's look at some incorrect examples and process them. So we've got this sentence. Jamie brought everything she needed to the exam, including pens, pencils, and a calculator. So does this have an independent clause before it? Jamie brought everything she needed to the exam. That sounds like an independent clause to me. We've got Jamie, that's our subject. We've got brought, that's a predicate. So that part works. But notice this comma creating a whole new clause before the including. Including is not an independent clause, so putting a colon after a dependent clause doesn't work. So even if you have an independent clause somewhere before a colon, it has to be specifically immediately before the colon. So in this case, even though there is an independent clause in the sentence, it doesn't work. So one of the ways you could fix this would be to just simply remove Or no, sorry, not the comma. Remove the colon. Jamie brought everything she needed to the exam, comma, including pens, pencils, and a calculator. Another way would be, like this correct example below, Jamie brought everything she needed to the exam, colon, pens, pencil, and a calculator. Notice it needed to be immediately. The independent clause needed to be immediately before the colon. So just some more examples to help this kind of settle in. This one at the top. When the detective told Mrs. Wilkinson the truth about her husband, you could describe her reaction in one word: shock. So we actually don't have to really worry about that first clause, when the detective blah, 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 blah. We need to worry about what's coming right before the colon. You could describe her reaction in one word. We've got a subject, that's you. And we've got a predicate, could describe, and it's a complete idea because we know what we're describing. So checks out. We've got an independent clause right before the colon, even though after the colon is only like one word grammatically, that's fine. It can be anything after the colon. So that checks out. And then this second one, we have, there is one big reason we don't talk about Bruno. His premonitions frightened the family. So there, in this case, is working as our independent clause, and then is our predicate, and we know what there is. There is one big reason, blah, blah, blah. So that is a complete idea. So that checks out, independent clause right before. And even though, you might notice, his premonitions, that's a subject. Frightened, that's a predicate. There's an independent clause after the colon, but that's completely fine. That's completely allowed. Okay, so the kind of main takeaway here is independent clause, colon, that's the absolute rule, and then anything goes after the colon. So let's look at some practice ones and work from there. So I'm going to do this one, and then we can do another one together. Over 20 years ago, in a landmark experiment in the psychology of choice, Professor Sheena Iyengar set up a jam tasting booth at a grocery store. The number of jams available for tasting blank. Some shoppers had 24 options, others only 6. Interestingly, the shoppers with fewer jams to choose from purchased more jam. So again, like I mentioned kind of in an earlier example, when you're working with this kind of question where it's a variety of punctuation in your options, normally you only really have to worry about the sentence that the blank is in. So I can just like completely ignore a majority of this information. And even this last sentence, none of that matters to me. I'm just worried about everything around the blank. So let's look for our clauses and go from there. So we have the number of jams available for tasting, and then we would fill in varied in the blank. The number of jams available for tasting varied. Is that an independent clause? So we've got a subject, the number of jams. I guess technically this whole phrase is the subject, but the number of jams works as a subject. So we have a subject. And then do we have a predicate? Well, we have to fill in the blank, but varied is a predicate. So the number of jams available for tasting varied. That totally works as an independent clause. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. That sounds like a dependent clause to me because there's no, it's not really structured. Actually, wait, that would be an independent clause. I'm lying to you. Some shoppers, that's a subject. And then had, that's a predicate. So we have to connect that independent clause to that independent clause. And we got varied, comma, while. Varied while. We know this doesn't work because we need something. While isn't a fanboy, so even though we have a comma and then a word, that doesn't click. And B, just a comma, doesn't connect independent clauses. So we would actually need A. So I remember, so I mentioned that there's 3 ways to connect independent clauses: a period, a semicolon, and then a comma. And there's technically 4 ways. The 4th way is through a colon. That totally works. Okay, so let's try the next one together. All right. In a 2016 study, Eastern Washington University psychologist Amani L. Alali found that among the study participants who experienced person, a physiological response akin to goosebumps or getting the chills while listening to music, there was one personality trait that they scored particularly blank: openness to experience. Okay, so same deal. We're seeing a bunch of different combinations of the same word with punctuation and that kind of thing. So trying to figure out where our independent clause is. So this whole thing is one sentence. We can't really do the same, like chop out huge sections of the passage situation here, but you know, we can still process. Do we have an independent clause beforehand? So in a 2016 study, Eastern Washington University psychologist Amani El Aleli. So that's a subject. This is a predicate found. Okay, that sounds good. The study participants who experienced frisson, blah, 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 while listening to music. There was, and that's supposed to say one. Sorry about that typo. There was one personality trait that they scored particularly blank. Okay. We see a couple of different clauses here. So let's actually look at what comes right before the blank. There was one personality trait that they scored particularly, and then we fill in high on. We've got a subject. We've got a predicate. So based on that, we've got an independent clause. What does it seem like our correct answer would be in that situation? We have an independent clause. There was one personality trait they scored particularly high on, and then we have openness to experience after the blank. How can we connect an independent clause to that phrase? Cool. Seeing some D's in the chat. Nice, nice, nice. So yeah, in this case, D is the only one that works. A semicolon only is necessary if you're connecting two independent clauses to one another. The phrase openness to experience is not an independent clause, so there's no semicolon necessary. And then same deal when you're looking at the period. Periods only work if there's two independent clauses on both sides, or if there's an independent clause on both sides of the period. So on openness to experience is not a independent clause. Cross that one out. And then high on openness to experience, we need something to connect these two clauses, and no punctuation doesn't work either. So the colon is the winner here. So I'm getting a question in the chat. If we see B and A, can we eliminate both? I introduced this idea that you have, these three ways to connect clauses, and that they're all functionally equal. So that's comma and, but comma any conjunction, right? You see A. In this case, you can't super eliminate both immediately because the period and the semicolon are in slightly different places, but I like that thought process. So just a little reminder that if you see a period and a semicolon and a comma conjunction, and those periods or semicolons or comma conjunctions happen in the same place, according to the SAT, those are functionally identical, and there's no reason to pick one over the other. So if you see both of those choices on in a multiple choice situation, you can eliminate them. Okay, cool. So that's colons. The kind of really main takeaway here is independent clause, and then colon, and then anything. So lock that in. Okay, so next kind of more of a cluster of rules or a set of principles than like one standalone rule, but okay. So this is actually a very important kind of grammatical situation here. Okay, we've got this table. We have top left, it's with no apostrophe. We have top right, it's with an apostrophe between the T and the S. Lock in your mind that this is a singular possessive pronoun, its, with no apostrophe, is singular and possessive. So you'd say it's teeth. If you're referring to like the tiger's teeth, right? ITS, no apostrophe, that's singular and possessive. However, if you have IT apostrophe S, that just means it is, right? The apostrophe in this case is standing in for the I of the is. It's a contraction. So it is IT apostrophe S. And then same kind of general vibe kind of applies to their, THEIR, and their, THEY apostrophe RE. If you see an apostrophe for either it's or their, that means it is two words. It is or they are. If you do not see an apostrophe in either it's or their, that is the possessive form of the verb. It's is singular and there is plural. So to kind of lock that in, you will see questions on the SAT that will have their answer choices look exactly like this. So this is the exact thing that they're testing you on. So just kind of keep this table etched in your mind somewhere. No apostrophe means it's possessive, and apostrophe means it is, or they are. It is a contraction, 2 words. Okay. So I'm using the word apostrophe. What do I mean when I say apostrophe? I mean this little kind of this little symbol in between the T and the S in it is. So apostrophes have 2 uses. They either create contractions. What's a contraction? It is multiple words put together. Don't, can't, there, it's. Do not, cannot, they are, it is. The other thing that they do, the other purpose they have, is that they make nouns possessive. So like the cat's claws or Mike's cat, right? So we're talking about the cat that belongs to Mike. The cat of Mike would be Mike's cat. That's the purpose that apostrophes serve. So in terms of just kind of grammatically how this kind of shows up on the SAT is, keep in mind the possessive must be followed by a noun or an adjective and a noun. It must be followed by something. A possessive noun on its own cannot serve as the subject of a sentence. It wouldn't make any sense to say Lily's was interesting, right? But it does make sense to say Lily's book was interesting. So a possessive noun cannot be the subject of a sentence, so there must be something after it. And then as far as singular and plural forms, when you're actually like, where does the apostrophe go? So, tiger on its own, that's a singular noun. Tigers with an S and no apostrophe, that's a plural noun. When you want to say one tiger's teeth, right? Tiger apostrophe S. That's a singular possessive. If you have a plural noun that ends in an S, you put the apostrophe after the S. So this last example, Tigers apostrophe, that's what you do in a situation where a plural noun with an S at the end of it, you just put that apostrophe after the S. So it's not that you do it this way for all plural nouns. So like, let's say we have the word peoples. That's a plural noun, but it doesn't end in an S. So you still do the apostrophe S. So the S apostrophe only happens with a plural noun that already ends in an S. Okay, but just lock that in because they will do stuff like that on the SAT. Move the apostrophe around and ask you which one is done correctly based on whether or not the noun is singular or plural. Okay. So 2 kind of takeaways here. A possessive noun cannot be the subject of a sentence, and the singular and plural forms look like these things on the right. Okay. So here's just some examples of what this kind of looks like in practice, right? The student's homework was late. We're talking about one student. So student apostrophe S. But if we're talking about multiple students who are all turning in their homework late, that's students apostrophe. And then just some other situations about how kind of these things can work, right? The babysitter ate all the children's ice cream. Like I mentioned, if you have people, it would still be people apostrophe S. In this case, children, same exact rule. It's a plural noun, but it doesn't end in an S, so you do children apostrophe S. And then you can have like situations like this where apostrophes can be stacked. The garden of Emily's parents' house was flooded after the storm. That's grammatically appropriate. Sounds kind of goofy, but you can do it. Okay. Just the kind of like, I guess like quick, if apostrophes are ever kind of tricking you and you need to know like a simple little grammatical rule or kind of a way to substitute them in a sentence to help it kind of sound right. Apostrophes serve as the word of. So instead of saying like the backpack of Angela, you'd say Angela's backpack. But you can still have of in a sentence. The roof of the Gothic cathedral, it wouldn't make sense necessarily to say, well, I guess it would make sense to say the Gothic cathedral's roof, but you can still use of in a situation like that. Okay. So, like I mentioned, when you see like this type of multiple choice situation, what this question is essentially asking you is to figure out what does this pronoun stand for, and is it singular or is it plural? And in context, does it need to be possessive or does it need to be an it is or a they are, right? So what's a pronoun, right? A pronoun stands in for a noun. Pronouns do not just stand in for the subject of a sentence. It can stand in for any noun at all. So notice this example sentence, the dog wagged its tail. In this case, it is, the dog. The dog is the subject of the sentence, but we're not saying the dog wagged the dog's tail. We use it to replace the dog in this case. And the same approach applies to like I, you, she, him, it, they, right? Pronouns stand in for nouns. So if you see like on the left of this slide, A, it's, B, it with an apostrophe, C, there, and D, there with an apostrophe, your thought process in that question is what noun is the pronoun standing in for? And then is it singular or plural? And do we want it to be possessive or do we want it to be a contraction? So just a quick kind of, I guess, practice round of, replacing nouns with pronouns. So I'll just fill in these. The elephant ate its own weight in bananas. That's easy. The elephants ate their own weight in bananas. The trick that they're going to play on you, though, in the SAT is in a situation like this final sentence. The herd of elephants ate blank own weight in bananas. So notice we do have a plural noun, and we have a singular noun. So in this case, the noun next to the takes precedence over elephants. So what it is actually, or what the pronoun is actually replacing is herd, which is singular. So in a situation like this, if you see an of, you can usually ignore what's next to the of, and you're replacing whatever, the of is referring to. So in this case, the herd, right, is what the of is connected to. So actually, even though elephants is plural, the pronoun is replacing herd, not elephants. So this becomes this idea about like trying to trace a sentence and figure out what specifically either a pronoun or later a verb needs to agree with. This idea becomes a little more important. So we'll have the opportunity to reinforce this a little bit. So if you see an of, ignore whatever noun is connected to that of, just for now. Okay. So same as what I just said. Okay, let's look at some practice questions. I'll do this first one, and then we can do the next ones together. So this first one. The human brain is primed to recognize faces, so much so that, due to a perceptual tendency called pareidolia, blank will even find faces in clouds, wooden doors, pieces of fruit, and other faceless inanimate objects. Researcher Susan Magsamen has focused her work on better understanding this everyday phenomenon. So, like I mentioned, we don't really need this last part. So we see a couple of pronouns in the answer choices. We're trying to figure out what are we replacing and what do we need to do about that, whether it's singular or plural, that sort of thing. So this is where our pronoun would be. Blank will even find faces in clouds. It's a thing doing an action. Something that can kind of be helpful in this situation is, okay, so it sounds like this is a subject, perhaps. Blank will even find faces in clouds. Maybe take a look at other sentences or other independent clauses. Other independent clauses in the sentence and see what its subject is. And it might be the same thing doing all these actions. So the subject of the previous independent clause, the human brain, is primed to recognize faces. So human brain up here is our subject. The human brain is primed. And so much so that the human brain will even find, we could sort of fill in that blank with the noun, the human brain. So in that case, the human brain is a singular noun, and there's only one thing here that works when we think of it that way. Because we're not talking about a person, that's what she would be. So it. It will even find faces in clouds, because we're talking about the human brain, which is a singular noun. Okay, so This one's a little bit different, but let's kind of put into practice the whole apostrophe situation. So I'm going to read the passage and then we can talk it through. Literate agents estimate that more than half of all nonfiction books credited to a celebrity or other public figures are in fact written by ghostwriters, professional authors who are paid to write other blank, but whose names never appear on book covers. So we have A, people, apostrophe S, stories. B, people's story, apostrophe S. C, people stories, no apostrophes. Or D, people, apostrophe S, story, apostrophe S. So in this situation, we're just trying to figure out which of these words needs to be possessive, and then which of these, is plural, that sort of thing. Take a second with this one and let me know your answers in the chat, and then we can break it down. And you can also private message me if you're more comfortable that way. Take just another quick second if you're still working on it or you're still taking a look. All right, let's break this one down. So people, right? People is already the plural form of the word person. So peoples isn't really a word. So if you see peoples in any of the answer choices, you can eliminate those. And in this case, what distinguishes D from A is this story apostrophe S. Is stories possessing the but? That doesn't really make sense, right? So in this case, A is the correct answer. All right, let's try this next one. So this one is more of the pronoun replacing sort of situation. So we have them, this, that, it. I'll read the passage and then we can try it out. When they were first introduced to Western Europe from Byzantium in the 11th century, table forks were met with much resistance. The Bishop of Ostia, St. Peter Damian, condemned the eating utensils because he considered blank dangerous and unnecessary luxury items. So try to find in this passage what this blank is replacing and then make the choice you need to make from there. Feel free to drop your answers in the chat or private message me if you're more comfortable. All right, take another quick second if you're still reading it and trying to figure it out. All right, cool. I saw a good number of A's in the chat. So in this situation, A is the correct answer. How do we know that? We're trying to figure out what is our pronoun replacing here. He considered blank dangerous. You can sort of like if this is more useful for your thought process, you can sort of like just fill in nouns throughout the sentence into that blank and see if the sentence makes sense there. Like, let's say we picked, this noun, the Bishop of Ostia. We're talking about St. Peter, right? St. Peter condemned the eating utensils because he considered St. Peter dangerous. That doesn't work, right? So the other kind of noun in the sentence is the eating utensils. So he considered the eating utensils dangerous and unnecessary. That clicks. So that's a plural noun. And then them is the only one that works here. And if you see like this or that, those sorts of words in a situation where it's pretty clear you're talking about pronouns, those words aren't pronouns. So you can also try to apply that step there too, if process elimination is more your jam. But yeah, in this case, we're looking for a plural pronoun. All right, so another one that's more about the apostrophe and putting it in the right place. So I'll give this one a read and we can break it down. French philosopher René Descartes doubted whether he could prove his own existence. Eventually, he found proof in his famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. The blank, complexity. Only those who exist would be able to ponder their existence. So the kind of trick with this one, or maybe not the trick, but a tip with this one is you don't need, well, in a way, you don't really need much of this at all. The answer choices kind of give you what you need. So take a look at those answer choices and see which one works in this context. Phrases simplicity masks its, phrases simplicity masks there, phrases simplicity masks there, or phrases simplicity masks its. Nice, nice. Feel free to private message me too if you're more comfortable that way. Take another second if you haven't already taken a look at this one. All right, awesome. So if you dropped a D in the chat, that is correct. Because we're just talking about one phrase, and then this pronoun that comes at the end of this phrase, what is it replacing? It's replacing the word phrase, and phrase is a singular noun. So D is the correct answer here. All right, so I kind of introduced this step of thinking about like identifying, words to figure out if they're singular or plural, and then knowing what to do about it. This type of question, a verb question, is where this type of thinking becomes even more important. Maybe not more important, but just as important. It's another kind of situation where you'll need to do that. So let's say you have these 4 choices in your answers. And jumped. Let's say you have jump, jumps, will jump, and jumped, right? You might notice what distinguishes jump from jumps is whether or not it is a singular or plural form of a verb. You use that jumps with an S when you're talking about a singular subject. You use that jump with no S when you're talking about plural subjects. But then there's also this added layer of will, jump, and jumped, which are more about tense and not about the singular plural part of it. So this is a kind of a 2-step process when you're seeing this style of question. You're trying to figure out what tense is the sentence in, what do I need to do about that, and then also where is my subject and is it singular or plural. So this is kind of the breakdown of it. So process, and what I recommend as step 1 typically is that you should figure out the subject. When you're talking about verbs, you might be using, you might be replacing, or you might be filling in the predicate of the sentence. It might not necessarily be the predicate, but figure out the subject of the sentence. And then once you've found that subject, determine whether or not that subject is singular or plural. And then if it's that simple, you can choose the correct answer just from there. Tense might also be a factor, but step 1 is to find that subject, determine whether it's singular or plural. And just like sometimes, words aren't always super clear about whether or not they're singular or plural, just depending on, certain words get formed differently. So if you want to just like throw in the word it or they or she or whatever, like just want to have a pronoun to throw in to see if the sentence still works, if you put in it or they, you can do that as well if it's hard to tell whether or not a certain noun is singular or plural. But yeah, step 1, find that subject. Is it singular? Is it plural? So just real quick, like in case it helps to just kind of reinforce, like, what is a singular predicate? Like what is a plural predicate? See the girl, that's a singular subject, dances. You see that S at the end. Typically, that means you're going for a singular form of the verb. Same deal, she plays, right? The box is the singular form of the to be verbs. I'll leave this one at the bottom for a second. Same deal with this stuff on the right. If you're looking for the girls, that's a plural subject. Dance, no S at the end. Normally, if that verb does not have an S at the end, you're working with plural forms. Same deal. Mary and Laura play, right? The boxes, and then are. That's the plural form of to be. Is becomes are when you're talking about multiple boxes. And then we have has. Let me keep these color coordinated. Has with an S. Normally that's the singular. And then have no S. Normally that's the plural. One quick thing I will mention. So remember my example when I said the herd of elephants. That's not how you spell elephants. Elephants. Let's say I'll put are hungry. Okay, so I mentioned when you have the herd of elephants, right? This is a slightly different kind of like construction of a subject. I introduced this idea of simple subjects and complex subjects last time. And this is kind of where that idea becomes more important and more useful. So if we're talking about what is the whole subject of the sentence, the herd of elephants blank hungry, the whole subject would be the herd of elephants. The complex subject would be the herd of elephants, but the simple subject, aka just like the important noun, the like standalone noun, the herd. Normally, if you see a the in front of a noun, that's a giveaway that is your simple subject. The herd is just the simple subject. When you're talking about subject predicate agreement, all you need to worry about is your simple subject. So in this case, if you see that of, you can ignore whatever's coming after the of for this type of question. And is herd singular? Sounds singular to me. So you go for is in this case. So it's not like they'll kind of start to add in extra, parts of subjects or make subjects more complicated. The important thing is just the simple subject. If you see the word the, that is a dead giveaway that's your simple subject. So in this case, the herd is a singular noun, even though we have the word elephants in sentence. That doesn't change anything about the subject predicate agreement rules. So the herd is hungry. So a quick kind of like extra little thing I'll mention connected to this idea. So there are some words, each, every. I'll start with those two. So each and every can be the subject of your sentence. And if you have either of these words in like the subject spot, these are always singular. Each is always singular. Every is always singular. A word like both would always be plural also. So each always singular, every always singular. The kind of one word where this is like an exception is the word all. So all can be the subject of your sentence. All of the elephants. That can be the subject of your sentence. I mentioned if you see like an of in a sentence, normally you can ignore whatever happens after the of. All is the exception to that because all can be either singular or plural. So in a case like the sentence, all of the elephants blank hungry, all doesn't really tell us enough about like whether it's singular or plural. So, but elephants is plural, so all of the elephants are hungry. So keep that in mind too. So if you see that of, you can, I'd say like 95% of the time, ignore what's after the of and just zoom in on your simple subject, the herd. But if you see the word all, you need to figure out, is the all talking about a plural thing or a singular thing? And then from there, that'll tell you whether or not you need to go, singular or plural. But yeah, those are all the kind of things to keep in mind when it comes to this step of the process. So let's kind of just walk through an example. Okay. In the 1970s, Janaki Amal, a prominent botanist, emerged as a powerful voice in India's environmental conservation movement. Her exhaustive chromosomal survey of plants in Silent Valley, a pristine tropical forest in Kerala, India, that is home to nearly 1,000 species of native flora, many of which are endangered, instrumental in the government's decision to preserve the forest. So, her exhaustive chromosomal survey of plants in Silent Valley ends up kind of as a whole being the subject and her exhaustive chromosomal survey. That would be kind of like the simple subject. This is a couple of words, but that's like the simple subject. That's a singular noun that's a singular subject. And then based on these choices here, we have a bunch of plural ones, which leaves us only with was. So that's the kind of thought process you're going to go for here. Okay. Let's try one of these out, and then there's one last rule I want to introduce to us before we wrap for today. Okay, so because the cycle of lunar phases, blank, 29.5 days to complete, that's supposed to be days, it's possible to observe 2 full moons in a single month, one at the beginning and at the end. Because a cycle of lunar phases is blanks, 29.5 days to complete, it's possible to observe 2 full moons in a single month, one at the beginning and one at the end. So take a look at this one and try it out for yourself. And you can drop your answer either in the general chat or in a private message to me. Right. Take another quick second if you haven't already tried it out for yourself. All right, I'm going to give it a quick breakdown. So we have a verb here. What's doing the verb? Looks like to me the subject of this clause, it's a dependent clause, so the subject predicate thing can still kind of work because it has a subject, it has a predicate. Looks like a cycle of lunar phases, in this case, is the subject of this clause. So then what's the simple subject of that? The cycle. And that's a singular noun. So that leads you to D, because are, have, and take, those are all plural forms of the verb. All right. So there's just one last thing I want to introduce, and this is like kind of a doozy. It's a little bit of a weird situation. And this is a rule I actually knew nothing about until I started like teaching the SAT. So it's not something not something I'm sure we might already be familiar with. So complex lists, what do I mean when I say that? Well, what do I mean when I say lists, right? Just look at this normal example. I went to the store to buy oranges, apples, and bananas. Total normal sentence, right? You use commas to separate all the items of the list. Easy peasy. But like, let's try to make this list a little bit more complicated. So look at this next example that I'm highlighting here. I went to the store to buy oranges, which are juicy, apples, which are crunchy, and bananas, which are soft. If you do something like this, grammatically, this no longer really makes sense because you're kind of, like using the same punctuation to separate all of these pieces of information, which implies that the words which are juicy are also like a different item in this list. It's just a little confusing. So there's this concept of a complex list, which is a very specific kind of grammatical situation. If you have a list like this second list, where you're adding in extra information inside each of the items. So let's like look at that kind of thing happening correctly. So look at this example down here, same as the other one, just with different punctuation. So I went to the store to buy oranges, comma, which are juicy, semicolon, apples, comma, which are crunchy, semicolon, and bananas, which are soft. So you might notice, in this case, to separate the kind of larger items within the list from each other, we use a semicolon, because in this case, the comma is being used to add extra information, to add extra clauses inside of the list. So sounds kind of goofy, but there will be questions that test this. So I want to look at one and break it down. Okay, so this question, using natural debris, such as dried blank, such as plastic bags, and more traditional art supplies, such as tree glue, Ghanaian artist Ed Franklin Gavua creates his striking Yikai African mask, which he hopes can help viewers rethink how waste is used in their communities. So the kind of like giveaway with this type of rule is if you see a semicolon in the sentence being used to not separate independent clauses. So another kind of giveaway is if you see like your answer choices look something like this, where it's like comma, semicolon, semicolon, comma, comma, semicolon, semicolon. Like this is a complex list question. Those are the kinds of giveaways. So from there, it's kind of a matter of identifying the pattern of the list and then making sure you pick the answer that conforms to that pattern. So what do I mean by patterns? Looking for phrases that kind of help tell you the structure of the thing. So we kind of helps to look at like phrases that are more complete. So like, let's say we look at this part of the sentence. We see a semicolon here after the word bags, after the such as phrase. Okay, So we know that our semicolons get used after a such as phrase. So this blank is completing a such as phrase. So we probably want a semicolon pretty early on into the blank. And then looks like commas separate the such as phrase from the earlier idea. So such as dried leaves, and then we have our answer choices here: dried leaves, comma, man-made trash. Doesn't seem like man-made trash and leaves are a part of the same concept, and then having such as plastic bags on its own wouldn't make any sense. So we could separate. We could eliminate A. Let's do the bottom one. D, leaves, semicolon, man-made trash, semicolon. Man-made trash isn't its own idea, and if we separate man-made trash from such as plastic bags, that doesn't make sense. So that one goes away. And then using just commas is the same problem as that bad example I showed you earlier. So I saw the B's in the chat. You're correct. In this case, B is the correct answer because it is keeping up the pattern. Notice such as dried leaves, semicolon, and then man-made trash introduces the next item on the list. Okay. So that's actually all 7 of the kind of principles I'm introducing for grammar. So we got through all of them. Congratulations. Thanks for joining me on your, winter recess Tuesday. That's all I've got for this. If you don't already know this, all of these, including the math bootcamp lessons, all of these will be posted on YouTube. You'll be getting a link if you don't already have one shortly. So you can always review these later if it helps to kind of practice them some more. Yeah, thanks for joining me. That's all I've got for today. If you didn't already, feel free to just drop your name in the chat as part of the attendance for this program. But yeah, that's all I've got for today. And thanks for joining me.